The snow did not care who you were in Ironmore. It fell on the Alpha's Grand Lodge, and on the Omega quarters alike. Same cold, same weight, same indifference. Sarah Voss had learned early that the snow was the most honest thing in their territory. It treated everyone equally. The pack did not. She was 23 years old, and had never once been called by her name at a tribunal. The Omega known as Sarah Voss. Beta Kane's voice cut through the longhouse, like an axe finding soft wood. He stood at the raised platform, broad-shouldered and dressed in the charcoal ceremonial sash of Ironmore's enforcers, his pale eyes scanning the gathered wolves with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Stands accused of harboring a foreign wolf within pack borders, a crime punishable by immediate exile. Sarah stood in the center of the longhouse floor, her wrists bound with cord, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She did not look at the ground. She had promised herself that much. Around her, the pack watched in silence. 50 pairs of eyes, some cold, some curious, most simply relieved it was not them standing where she stood. That was the particular cruelty of Ironmore. Not that wolves hated each other, but that they had learned to be grateful for each other's suffering. It meant the attention was elsewhere. It meant they were safe for one more season. She had known this was coming. She had known it the moment Beta Kane's shadow fell across the threshold of her small storage room 3 days ago, and she had looked up from where she knelt beside the pup, a strip of linen in her hands, and seen the expression on his face. Not surprise, not anger, satisfaction. He had been looking for something to use against her for 2 years. She had just handed it to him. She had found the pup 4 nights before that, during the hour just before dawn when the cold was most vicious and the forest beyond the border markers held its breath. She had been gathering frostbark, a rare fungus that grew only in the deepest freeze, essential for treating lung fever, of which 3 of Ironmore's pups had already fallen sick that season. She was not supposed to be past the Easter markers. Omegas rarely were, but the healer who outranked her had refused to go, and the pups were burning from the inside, and Sarah had never been good at sitting still while something suffered. She heard him before she saw him, a sound so small it should have been swallowed by the wind, a whimper, thin and exhausted, like a voice that had already cried itself nearly silent. She followed it to a hollow between 2 collapsed pines, and there he was, a pup, no more than 8 or 9 weeks old, silver-furred, which was rare, almost unsettling in its beauty, that pale coat against the black soil. One of his back legs was twisted at a wrong angle. His breathing was shallow. His eyes, when they cracked open at her approach, were the color of storm clouds, and they looked at her with an expression she recognized. Not fear. Resignation. She had seen that look on the faces of Ironmore's Omegas, the look of a creature that has stopped expecting to be helped. "I've got you," she told him, and picked him up. She had not named him immediately. Naming implied intention, and her intention, she told herself those first 2 nights, was simply to stabilize him, set the leg properly, ensure he would survive long enough to be relocated somewhere safe. She had no plan beyond that. She was not sentimental. But then he had pressed his small silver nose against her collarbone on the 2nd night, and exhaled, and she had felt something in her chest shift, like a door swinging open onto a room she had forgotten existed. She called him Ash. She had 3 days with him. 3 days of waking before dawn to check his breathing, of crushing dried willow root into warm water for the inflammation in his leg, of learning the particular pitch of his different cries. Hunger, pain, loneliness, contentment. 3 days of something that felt, absurdly and dangerously, like happiness. Then Kane came, and happiness, as it always did in Ironmore, ended. The accused has no defense recognized under pack law. Kane continued from the platform, his voice smooth with rehearsed authority. The foreign wolf has been removed and destroyed. Something moved through Sarah's chest, hot and terrible, and the tribunal has already reached its decision. Let the record confirm that Sarah Voss is hereby stripped of her pack bond, her territory rights, and her designation as healer. She is cast out from Ironmore lands before the next sunrise. Any wolf found offering her shelter, food, or aid will face secondary tribunal. There was no vote. There was no voice given to her. There was not even the pretense of justice. Just the machinery of power moving efficiently, through its predetermined conclusion. She looked at Cain as they cut the cord from her wrists. He met her gaze and almost smiled. She looked out at the gathered wolves. No one moved. No one spoke. 50 pairs of eyes found the floor, the walls, the middle distance, anywhere but her face. Except one. Elder Mara stood at the far edge of the longhouse, small and still, her silver-streaked hair pinned back beneath a dark hood. Her face was unreadable, but as the guards turned Sarah toward the door, the old woman moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, and when she reached Sarah's side, she pressed a worn leather satchel into her hands. Her voice was barely a breath. "That pup is not what they say." A pause, weighted with something heavy and deliberate. "Run and don't look back." They pushed Sarah out into the snow. The cold hit her like a wall, sudden and absolute. Behind her, the longhouse doors closed with a sound like a bone snapping clean. She stood alone in the dark, a satchel in her hands and a pack bond dissolving in her chest like salt in water, the slow, aching erasure of belonging. She looked at the tree line. She ran. The frozen wilds had a sound at night. Not silence. Silence was the absence of something. This was different. This was presence. A low, resonant stillness that pressed against the eardrums like deep water, broken only by the occasional crack of a frost-split branch or the distant, hollow cry of something that had long since stopped hoping to be found. Sarah had been walking for 2 days. She had stopped flinching at the sound somewhere around the second sunrise. Survival had a way of rearranging your priorities. She ate what Elder Mara's satchel provided. Strips of dried venison, 2 hard biscuits wrapped in cloth, a small pouch of salt. She melted snow in a tin she found at the bottom of the bag. Heating it over fires, she built small and smokeless, the way her mother had taught her before her mother had stopped teaching her anything at all. She treated her feet each night, wrapping the blisters with the linen strips meant for other wounds. She kept moving. She did not let herself think about Ash. Or she tried not to. She was not entirely successful. She found Leora, or rather, Leora found her, on the morning of the 3rd day. Sarah had crouched beside a stream to fill her tin when she heard the deliberate snap of a twig behind her. Not an accident. A warning. She straightened slowly, turning to find a woman leaning against a pine with the casual posture of someone who had been watching for quite some time and wanted her to know it. She was perhaps 30, lean and sharp-featured, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of stillness that came from years spent surviving in places that punished noise. A rogue. Sarah recognized the signs. No pack scent, no territory markings on her clothing. Eyes that moved constantly and trusted nothing. "You build good fires," Leora said. "Small. Smart. Most exiles announce themselves like idiots. I'm not interested in being found." "Then you've walked into the worst possible territory." Leora pushed off the tree, nodding eastward. "Voldemort soldiers have been combing these wilds for 6 weeks. 3 battalions. They're not loud about it, but they're everywhere. You crossed the wrong ridge. They'll have you in chains before you finish a sentence." Sarah looked east. Through the tree line. She could see nothing, but she believed her. "What are they looking for?" Leora was quiet for a moment, the hesitation of someone deciding how much to give away. "A pup," she finally said. "Silver-furred. Taken from Voldemort 3 months ago." The word landed in Sarah's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She kept her face even. "I don't know anything about that," she said. Leora studied her with flat, intelligent eyes. "Didn't say you did." She traveled with Leora for 2 days. Not from trust. Trust was a currency neither of them had, but from the cold logic of survival. Leora knew the wilds. She knew which ridges the soldiers patrolled, which valleys held shelter, which frozen streams were safe to cross. She shared this knowledge without warmth and without expectation, and Sarah accepted it the same way. On the second night, Leora told her the rest. They sat beside a banked fire in a shallow cave, the wind moving hard outside. Leora spoke without looking at her, her voice flat and informational, like a woman reciting geography. The pup had been taken from the royal nursery of Voldemort on a moonless night, 3 months prior. A servant, a trusted one, which was the particular horror of it, had smuggled him across 2 borders wrapped in a feed sack, acting on orders from someone whose name Leora either didn't know or wouldn't say. The plan, as best anyone had pieced together, was to deliver the pup to a rival faction and use him as leverage against the Alpha King. But somewhere in the crossing, something had gone wrong. The servant had panicked, abandoned the pup in the outer wilds, and disappeared. The pup had been alone in the snow for at least 2 days before anyone found him. Sarah stared at the fire for a long time after Leora finished. "The soldiers," she said quietly. "They're carrying a portrait." "Yes." Silver fur, storm-colored eyes. Leora finally looked at her. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise, but the recalibration of someone updating their understanding of a situation. "You've seen it." "I've seen him," Sarah said. "I had him for 3 days. My pack took him when they exiled me." She paused. "They said they destroyed him." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the cave. They found her the next morning. She had told Leora she intended to turn herself in. Leora had called her several unflattering things and then, respecting the decision with the pragmatism of someone who had learned not to waste energy on other people's choices, disappeared into the tree line before the soldiers crested the ridge. Commander Wren was not what she expected. He was younger than his reputation suggested, sharp-jawed, dark-eyed, with the economical movements of a soldier who had stopped performing authority because he no longer needed to. He looked at her the way you looked at a problem you were not sure yet was a problem. "Your name," he said. "Sarah Voss, formerly of Ironmore Pack." She kept her hands visible and her voice level. "I need to speak with the king." He studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at the satchel on her back, at the particular shape of the herb pouches, the linen wrappings, the small folded tin. A healer's kit. His eyes returned to her face with a different quality of attention. "Bind her," he said to his soldiers. Then to her, "You'll get your audience." The throne room of Voldemort was nothing like she had imagined. She had expected grandeur, high ceilings, gold, the theatrical architecture of power. What she found was a long stone hall, austere and cold, lit by iron chandeliers and smelling of wood smoke. Functional, unapologetic, like the man who stood at its center. King Aldrich Vane was tall, dark-haired, dressed in no ceremonial finery, just a soldier's tunic and the particular stillness of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. He was perhaps 30 years old and looked both younger and much older than that simultaneously. His eyes, when they found her across the room, were the color of deep amber, and they were currently the eyes of a man who had not slept properly in 3 months. He looked at her chains, then at her satchel, which Wren had placed on the stone table beside him, then at her face. "They tell me you treated him," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of someone who had learned to keep everything important below the surface. "Yes." "For how long?" 3 days. Something moved across his face too quickly to name. He looked down at the satchel, at the herbs laid out by Wren's careful hands, the frostbark, the willow root, the carefully rationed linen. His jaw tightened. "These are not common remedies," he said. "The willow root preparation, the concentration required to reduce inflammation in a pup that young, without causing organ stress. Most trained healers wouldn't know that ratio." "Most trained healers weren't taught by someone who loved what they did," Sarah said. The room was very still. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. They gave her a room with a window. It faced east, toward the frozen wilds, and on clear mornings the light came through pale and precise, and landed on the stone floor in a long gold rectangle that Sarah found herself standing in each dawn like a woman remembering what warmth felt like. The room was small. The bed was softer than anything she had ever slept on. She did not trust it for the first 4 nights, lying rigid on top of the blankets, listening to the palace breathe around her. By the 5th night, exhaustion won. It usually did. She was not a prisoner. Aldrich had been clear about that, but she was not free either. She existed in the careful in-between space of someone whose story had not yet been fully believed. Guards stood outside her door. Her movements within the palace were permitted but observed. She ate in a small antechamber rather than the great hall. She was treated with a courtesy that felt, at times, more clinical than kind. She told herself that was fine. She had not come here for kindness. She had come because Ash was here. They brought him to her on the 6th morning. He was clean, well-fed, wrapped in a small blanket embroidered with the Voldemort crest, and the moment he was carried through her door, he began making the particular urgent sound she had learned in that cold storage room in Ironmore. The sound that meant you. Specifically you. Where have you been? She sat on the floor without thinking about it, and he climbed into her lap with the absolute confidence of a creature who had decided, at some fundamental level, that she was his. She pressed her face into his silver fur and did not cry. She was close. She did not. When she looked up, Aldrich was standing in the doorway. He watched her with Ash for a moment, something open and unguarded in his expression, something she suspected he was not aware he was showing. Then his face composed itself, and he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He wouldn't settle, he said. For 3 days after Ren brought him back. Wouldn't eat properly. Wouldn't sleep. A pause. Now I understand why. Sarah looked down at Ash, who had already fallen asleep with his nose tucked under her wrist. He's resilient, she said. He was like that in the wilds too. Frightened but fighting. He gets that from his mother, Aldrich said quietly. Then something crossed his face, grief, sudden and unguarded, and he looked away. She died in the raid that preceded his abduction. I didn't. He stopped, rebuilt the wall, brick by careful brick. I didn't know they had taken him until the following morning. The room was very quiet. I'm sorry, Sarah said. She meant it simply, without architecture or performance. He seemed to recognize that, because he looked back at her with something that was almost gratitude. The intelligence came 2 weeks later. Sarah was in the lower corridor, treating a soldier's infected shoulder, when Commander Wren moved through the hall with the particular velocity of a man carrying information that could not wait. She heard Aldrich's chamber door close hard. She heard, through the stone walls, the silence that followed, more communicative than shouting. She knew before anyone told her. Aldrich found her an hour later in the herb room, where she had taken to organizing the palace's chaotic medicinal stores into something functional. He stood in the doorway, watching her work, and she could feel the controlled anger radiating off him like heat off iron. Beta Cain of Ironmore, he said. She set down the jar in her hands carefully. How long have you known? An hour. His voice was measured in the way of someone measuring it deliberately. He was acting as intermediary for a faction within the Eastern Territories. The plan was to use Ash's leverage to fracture my alliances before the spring councils. He paused. Your exile was not incidental. He needed you removed before you could identify the servant who passed through Ironmore's territory the night Ash was abandoned. She had suspected something like this. Suspecting it and hearing it confirmed were different weights entirely. Elder Mara, she said. She knew. She has already sent word. She is willing to testify. He looked at her steadily. I am mobilizing within the week. I want you to come. She met his eyes. Why? Because you were wronged on Ironmore's ground. Because Mara trusts you, and her wolves will respond to that trust. He paused, and something shifted beneath the formal words. And because I find that I make better decisions when you are nearby, which is inconvenient and true. She almost smiled. I'll come. Ironmore fell without violence. That was the word that moved through the territories afterward. Not that Voldemort had crushed them, but that they had simply collapsed inward, like a structure that had been rotting at its supports for years and finally met a wind strong enough to finish the work. Aldrich's battalions surrounded the territory at dawn. There was no battle. There was only Beta Cain, standing in the longhouse where he had exiled Sarah 4 weeks prior, his rehearsed composure finally exhausted, his lies arriving slightly too late to be useful. Elder Mara stepped forward before he finished his first sentence. She spoke for 11 minutes. When she finished, no one in the longhouse looked at Cain. They looked at the floor. They looked at their hands. They looked at the particular distance that opens between a person and their own complicity when the lights finally come on. Cain was taken in chains. Ironmore's sovereignty was dissolved. Its Omegas, the lowest ranked, the forgotten, the ones who had watched Sarah be pushed into the snow and found the floor with their eyes, were formally released from pack obligation and offered resettlement under Voldemort's protection. It was the one condition Sarah had named. Aldrich had agreed without hesitation. He found her afterward at the edge of the ironmore tree line, standing at the place where the eastern markers had once been. The posts were gone now, pulled up by Wren's soldiers that morning. The snow was unmarked. The border, for the first time in her life, did not exist. She heard him approach. She did not turn around. "You could have asked for anything," he said, stopping beside her. "Land, title, a pack of your own, loyal only to you. I know. You asked for them." He meant the Omegas, the forgotten ones. They were always worth asking for. She looked at the empty space, where the markers had stood. No one just did it. A long silence. The good kind, the kind that didn't need filling. "Stay," he said. Not a command, not a king speaking. Just a man, standing in the snow, asking. She turned and looked at him, at the amber eyes that had watched her warily across a throne room and had slowly, over weeks and small honest moments, learned to look at her differently, at the careful man underneath the composed king, at the grief he carried and the way he had chosen, quietly and without fanfare, to carry it with more gentleness lately. She saw him clearly. That was the thing. She was not dazzled. She was not rescued. She was simply a woman standing in the ruins of the place that had broken her, looking at a man who had not once asked her to be smaller than she was. "I'm not staying for the crown," she said. "I'm not offering the crown." His voice was quiet. "I'm offering me, such as that is." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, simple, certain, and entirely her own. Behind them, Aldrich did something that his court would speak of for a generation. He dropped to one knee in the snow, not in the formal tradition of his rank, not in the theatrical gesture of ceremony, but in the plain, deliberate way of a man acknowledging something true. He called her his equal. The snow fell on them both the same.